Hey there friends, my name is Jim and today I'd like to talk a little bit about freedom. Over the last few weeks since the conflict in Eastern Europe began, I've been talking about it in a different way from the majority of Western pundits. For the most part, if you're in the West and you turn on the news about Ukraine, you'll see every different reporter discussing it from the position that Ukraine is the underdog. Just a poor country that wanted to be left alone after the fall of the USSR, and now Russia's trying to bully it back into submission. As you can clearly see next to me, I have a Gadsden flag with the classic "Don't tread on me" emblazoned below the snake. The classic symbol of individual sovereignty over state control. So I can understand how that probably seems a bit incongruous. A couple of days ago, I received a comment from a gentleman named Andrei Kovacs who said, "Funny how you have a 'Don't tread on me' flag behind you, but you think Ukrainians refusing to be trodden on is in any measure a bad thing. People will die. The price of freedom is blood." Well, Andre, I understand the confusion, but I really don't think that Ukraine is the underdog that most people consider it as. Nor do I think that they're fighting for is the ideal of freedom that it's being sold as. In my estimation, this isn't a fight for the freedom of the average Ukrainian, or even a fight to make the country freer as a whole. But it's basically a Western proxy fight of Western imperialism versus Eastern imperialism, and they're taking ethnic brothers and forcing them to fight for the benefits of billionaires who don't give a shit about them. I've said it before and I'll say it again. What's most important to me is there being no more brother wars. So, from long before the beginning of the conflict in Eastern Europe that's going on right now, Russia was already seen from the long-term bureaucrats in the US government as the big bad wolf, the biggest threat to the so-called democracy of Europe and the West. You see, they live under a different reality than the rest of us, and they sincerely believe that Russia somehow had a major effect on the 2016 US election, despite their only evidence being a couple of bot farms ran by a place called the Internet Research Agency, which was a troll group in Russia that made a bunch of fake Facebook accounts to get boomers to argue about politics. You know, they'd set up like a fake pro-life Facebook group and get two bots on to argue with one another over the most controversial aspects, and then wait for real people to show up and get flung around by the maelstrom of propaganda. But that's kind of the entire problem. On our side, we have the US State Department saying that Russia and Trump colluded with one another to hurt Clinton and win the election, but what is collusion in this case? Like a normal citizen like you or me hears that word and immediately thinks of some sort of dark, smoky room filled with Monopoly men handing big bags of cash to one another. The reality is that a bunch of nerdy Slavic neckbeards got together and tried and make Americans angry and ended up convincing a minuscule percentage of the people to change their minds. That tiny act by people who aren't even officially sponsored by the Kremlin pissed off the Western cosmopolitan elites enough to make them completely flip their stance on Russia. Remember, back in 2012 during the second presidential debate, Mitt, I love cocks and dicks and balls Romney, argued that Russia was the biggest threat to the United States, and the response shows people just what Democrats thought of the potential danger from Russia at that time.
Governor Romney, I'm glad that you recognize that Al-Qaeda is a threat, because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not Al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. But Governor, when it comes to our foreign policy, you seem to want to import the foreign policies of the 1980s, just like the social policies of the 1950s and the economic policies of the 1920s.
So clearly we haven't always had an issue with Russia. We haven't always considered Russia this bogeyman. And they've been doing the same project of causing online turmoil and trying to sway Western people's opinions through their online trolling since at least 2003. Which is to say that at the time of this statement, when Obama said that Russia wasn't one of the bigger threats to the West, he knew about the Russian attempts to sway public opinion via the internet. Seriously though, is anyone under the impression that the United States doesn't do the same thing? If the United States is going to call out this kind of thing as some sort of unique evil that needs to be destroyed, then it's kind of hypocritical for us to be doing it ourselves. For instance, there was a program called Operation Earnest Voice that started back in 2011, which was actually first developed as a psychological weapon, and it was used to sway opinions all throughout the Middle East in the exact same way as the Internet Research Agency, if not a bit more thorough considering that it led to the Arab Spring. The brainchild of General Petraeus, Operation Earnest Voice was, as he described, an effort to counter extremist ideology and propaganda. This is such an open secret that they actually have a website based in the UK with their services listed for purchase. As you can see, their methods are myriad and obtuse, with such options as deep deception, production of news websites with automated content, personalized propaganda, clone audiences, lookalike audiences, mobilization and distribution of fake accounts for fake traffic, fake methods, message amplification, and information warfare. So, as you can see, the whole narrative that Trump colluded with Russia to topple democracy in the United States and control the White House is so wildly overblown that it would seem crazy if it was anything other than politics that they were attempting to control. Nobody in government's actually worried that Russia is an existential threat to our nation, nor are they really concerned that they had or will have a sway in who we go to vote for. What they were really looking for is a bogeyman, a red herring to throw all of the blame from problems that they created years ago. They know the time for austerity measures is coming, meaning food and energy rationing, and they need someone to shift responsibility onto, lest the people they're supposed to represent realize what's taken place. However, these absolute muppets have hurt themselves in their confusion, because now they've changed the global chessboard from one where Russia exists but is largely ignored, to one where Russia is undesirable number one. And while you could get away with blaming them for things they never did without too much of a repercussion, once you move to start pushing the world to get rid of them, you force retaliation. Putin knows our history regardless of how much we wish to deny it. When people try to play nice with us and give up their WMDs and start doing politics the Western way, it either ends with their country in complete demographic ruin like our allies, or with the regime overthrown, throwing the nation into internal chaos like Libya or Syria or Iraq or any of a dozen others. He wouldn't kowtow to the Western regime, and that means that from the eyes of the rootless transnational elites in charge, he must be gotten rid of. However, unlike the nations we have toppled in the past, Russia is an actual superpower. We just kept poking the bear over and over and over again, and somehow we're surprised when it bites us. From Putin and many Russians' point of view, Ukraine is actually as much of their land as Moscow is, and they've just been separated due to other countries wanting Ukraine for its rich soil and resources, which isn't entirely wrong. The Western governments and elite oligarchs have long had an interest in consolidating their control of Europe in order to pen in China, and Russia, and more specifically Putin, has always kind of been a fly in the ointment of this plan. You see, Putin's long lamented the actual breakup of the USSR as one of the major tragedies of modern history, and having any of his neighboring countries join NATO is a not-so-subtle signal from these countries that they're no longer under Russia's sphere of influence, and he still has this kind of dream of uniting the former territories of the USSR in order to become a rival political bloc to the US and China. But with all of this, we're actually pushing him into friendship with China, meaning that what's going to actually happen is these two political blocs are going to be Russia-China versus the US and Western Europe. In order to understand that, you have to look into a little bit of the history. So after World War II in the 1950s, the Warsaw Pact was signed, which basically split Europe into two big political blocs, with the middle point being the Berlin Wall. And when the USSR broke up, the leader of the Soviets at the time, who was named Mikhail Gorbachev, was given a ton of promises that the NATO alliance wouldn't expand past what was then the East German border in the 1990s. This was denied by the US government and mainstream media until recently, when a series of documents were released confirming that among his assurances were one that NATO would not be moved, quote, 1 inch eastward from eastern Germany. If the US didn't make these promises, the USSR wouldn't have agreed to dissolve the Warsaw Pact, and we would still be in the middle of the Cold War. Now, as you can see, we have thoroughly broken that promise, but Ukraine seems to have been their final straw. They had a fairly good relationship with Ukraine after all. That is up until 2014, when a US-backed color revolution overthrew the democratically elected president, and the Western-backed oligarchs chose their representative to be a man named Vladimir Zelensky, who up until that point had been a comedian and actor. He actually worked for one of the top oligarchs, a Jewish-Ukrainian Cypriot billionaire named Igor Kolomoisky, which is how they knew each other. Now, Igor Kolomoisky is so thoroughly corrupt that he's actually never allowed back into the United States, but don't let this shake your confidence in who he chooses to be in charge of Ukraine. He'd been employing Mr. Zelensky as the lead in a television show in which he actually played Ukraine's president. Now, I'm just one of those crazy right-wing conspiracy nuts, but I feel like if you lay it out, it sounds kinda bad. A billionaire handpicking the president after a revolution backed by the CIA, and the guy handpicked used to play the president on TV? I don't know. Maybe I'm just crazy. But also, you know that whole Azov battalion, the group that's been doing much of the frontline fighting who Putin declared Nazis? Well, they definitely use Nazi regalia, but it starts to look a little bit sketchy when you find out the same billionaire who pushed Zelensky to go from pretend president to real president also financed the Azov battalion. As a matter of fact, documents were released to show that Israel was directly financing Azov through Kolomoisky, who has Israeli citizenship. A Jewish billionaire funding an Eastern European neo-Nazi militia. Nope, that's glowing a little too brightly for me to take at face value. This is why I have a problem just blindly rooting for Ukraine in this fight. The flag I have behind me represents fighting for your independence, not fighting for one side of a globalist neoconservative world structure. When I see footage of Ukrainian soldiers defacing Russians' dead bodies, or vice versa, I don't feel any elation on either side of it, or rage on either side of it. All I feel is disappointment that there are still people who, after 2 years of all of our governments proving to us that they're completely worthless and probably actually demons, there are still people that are willing to fight and die for these people. I'm neutral in this conflict, although I'd prefer it just ended. I'd be foolish not to point out that if this leads to the United States no longer being the singular world superpower, it'll probably be a positive good for everybody. Already, though, we've given up any global leverage we had against Russia. Like, you remember a few weeks ago when they were talking about kicking Russia off the SWIFT international payment system and how that would cripple their government and they would immediately withdraw. Well, they've already created a new version of SWIFT, and now India is using that to purchase oil from Russia using rubles, which is propping up their currency and allowing this entirely new political paradigm to form. The Biden administration has so overplayed their hand that it may lead to the collapse of the United States as a sole world superpower, and they don't even seem to know it, even now. According to them, Ukraine is still taking back territory every day, and they'll march all the way to Moscow and collapse Vladimir Putin's regime, and that is so delusional that it gives you a good glimpse of just how separated the decision makers are from the reality that their decisions has happened. What they should be doing if they insist on continuing to posture against Russia is reopen the Keystone XL pipeline and call on a panel of oil CEOs and government energy experts to get together and find the most efficient way to get back to energy independence the way they were in 2018 under Trump. If we had complete energy independence and we were posturing against Russia, then guess what? We actually have some leverage to use. But instead, we are hoping Europe is okay with freezing this winter and begging for oil from Saudi Arabian royalty who won't even answer Biden's phone calls. I've broken down in other videos the various supply chains and commodities that are going to suffer due to this, and I'm sure the powers that be are making a killing short selling anything they know will be impacted by the continued fighting, as they sit in their ivory towers, smiling and laughing at the plebeians struggling to get what they need to meet the bare necessities. That video right there, that fight for the bare necessities, that's coming to a neighborhood near you. All massive famines and rationing, and for what? Is this also that the Ukrainian people can thrive more under their current corrupt Western leadership than they would under Russian corrupt leadership? No. This isn't a fight for independence, but rather another trick by the people in charge to get us to look at the slaughterhouse in front of us and cheer, unaware that that's their plan for all of us. Till next time, guys. Peace.